We take up part 2 of this story, where a young girl who was traveling the world in search of answers to life's greatest questions had found her way to the island of Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, where she had met an extraordinary teacher who was like one of the ancient mystics. On one day, where she had traveled with 2 friends into the beautiful Waipio Valley, lush tropical valley, on a day where the river was flooding and had got caught in a flash flood and was rescued by grace. We now find them on the opposite side of the bank. They were heading to the back of Waipio Valley to collect some things for the young guy, Jax, who had been living in the valley for several months. That was the whole reason for their journey that day, and they had almost died in the river because of the flash flood. But magically, extraordinarily, they had been lifted out of the river in a way that was really beyond imagining. On the opposite side of the bank, they made their way to collect the items that they had gone for, because what else was there to do? The young girl had decided that under no circumstances was she getting back into that river. It was continuing to flood. The water was just getting faster and higher. And now she was really scared, because now she knew how dangerous a river can be. So they collected Jax's things from the back of the valley. And to her absolute shock, she found that what they were collecting was a small number of 5-gallon drums that seemed to be full, with great reverence, of junk, and that she had risked her life for buckets filled with tarps and glass jars and goodness knows what else. But was that why they had gone to the valley? Was that why they had almost died, to collect things that seemed to be really almost worthless? She tried to hide her frustration as she walked with the 2 guys, Jax and Greg, from the back of the valley down toward the beach, because there was nothing else to do now. They were going to have to make a camp for the night. There was no way to get out. The rain was not letting up. It was actually getting stronger. The young girl had lost her shoes in the flash flood and was walking barefoot, even through one of the taro patches where there seemed to be glass. But somehow she managed to get through without cuts. As they walked toward the beach at the head of the valley, they were looking for plants that were edible. They were looking for a source of fresh water that was clean enough to drink, because who knows how long they were going to be stuck in the valley. What they discovered was that pretty much everybody had left. Everyone that lived in the valley knew that when the rains come really hard, and when they're going to last for days and days, and when the river is going to flood and become dangerous to pass, the safest place to be is on the other side. And so there they were, seemingly alone in the valley, hungry, anxious from their traumatic experience in the flash flood, and trying to figure out how to create enough shelter and warmth and sustenance, because they could maybe be there for many days. Life had something else in store. When they got to the ocean front, there amongst the trees came the most extraordinary smell of curry. There was a smell of curry being cooked. Where was it coming from? It was unfathomable. Here in this place of rain and lush green forest where nobody was, there was good food happening. They followed the smell and found themselves in a small camp with 2 beautiful souls, Cookie and Sabina, 2 young hippie kids who had also been stranded in the valley, but they had come down camping and they had bought provisions. Oh my gosh, this was like an answered prayer. They'd been stuck in the valley for maybe 3 or 4 days at that point, and they were running a little low on supplies, but they had lentils and they were making good food, and they offered to share. It was like a dream come true. They had a tent, and Jax volunteered himself to sleep in that. They had candles, but they didn't have jars so that they could light them. Well, one of our 5-gallon drums had the jars inside of them. And so we actually had light, amazingly. The only other thing that was needed then was some shelter for Greg and the young girl. Amazingly, one of the 5-gallon drums contained tarps, and so they set up a shelter. And in that way, everyone knew that they were going to eat well and sleep that night, and maybe they'd be stuck in the valley for days, but now they had good company, and we had a little food. It occurred to the young girl that she should try to call her family, try to leave a message at least, try to let somebody know that they were okay, that they were safe. But there was no way, there was no phone signal. This valley was so huge and the valley walls were so high. There was no way to use the cell phone. She felt frustrated. How could she get a message to her family? At that moment, Greg, she noticed, had quietly walked away from the group. He didn't say anything. He just took himself away with one of the 5-gallon drums and sat quietly. He seemed to be meditating, rather like they did with the teacher that day. He was very quiet, and then he started to look very intent and focused. Not so much a meditation, but now he seemed to be focusing on something, and she couldn't fathom what he was doing. After some time, he came back to camp. "What were you doing there?" she said. "I don't understand. You seem to be meditating, but then all of a sudden it changed." He said. "Well, this may not make very much sense, but I was letting Human know that we're okay." "How did you let him know? We don't have cell phone signal." "No," he smiled. He didn't explain, but he simply said, "That isn't how we communicate." She didn't understand. "Do you think he got the message? Were you just telling him in your mind?" "Something like that," said Greg. "He got the message okay. He's in Kona right now. He's stuck in traffic. He's been down there for hours. He's a little frustrated. He took one of the students back there, and there's just a lot of traffic today. I told him that we'd be home by noon tomorrow." At this, the young girl was just amazed. "How can you possibly think we'll be home by noon tomorrow?" She said, "Look at the rain. It hasn't stopped. It hasn't slowed down. It's only getting heavier, and the river is just flooding more and more. We could be here for days." "We'll be home by noon," he smiled. "Let's go eat something." They enjoyed the food, put up tarps, made a shelter, and slept under the tarps with rain honestly dripping on them all night long. It was pouring so hard, and the ocean, which was very close, had only gotten rougher and rougher, and these huge waves were crashing so loud it was hard to sleep, but they were exhausted after their adventure. She didn't even try to think about how they would get out of the valley. It seemed impossible. It was enough just to have food, have shelter, and have found company. And with that, they slept. When the day broke, Jax was nowhere to be seen. They searched the camp. They called his name. They walked down to the beach, but the waves were huge. They were crashing harder than ever, and there was no sign of him. She worried a little bit that something terrible had happened, that he had tried to cross the river, and that somehow he was in trouble. But there was nothing to be done. He was gone. All they could do was really wait. And so they passed a few hours until suddenly there was a familiar voice coming into camp. "Hey guys, I've got a boat. Let's go. It's time. Let's get out of here." It was Jax. They couldn't understand what he was saying. He seemed a little bit delirious. He was very excited. Come, he said. "I've got a boat. We're going to get out." "How are you going to get out?" said Greg. "The river has gotten so much faster. It's so much higher." Where did you find a boat? Where have you been?" And so Jax briefly paused and sat down in the circle and told them the story. He felt responsible because the whole reason they were in Waipio Valley was because they were helping him get his stuff. He actually did have some valuable things, some useful things in a different bucket, but most of it really was nonsense. And he knew it, and he felt a little guilty for getting them into this difficult situation. And he thought about it through the night, and what he did was he went down to the ocean first thing in the morning, and being a strong swimmer, he swam into the huge surf break, duck dived underneath, swam out around the back of the break, and came in body surfing on the opposite side of the river. Oh my gosh. That was a courageous thing to do. And then hiked to the back of the valley where Greg's truck was sitting next to the really huge river that had almost carried them away the day before. And the keys were still in the truck. The streams that they had originally driven through had gotten bigger, but somehow, just through grace, the truck kept going. It was like a miracle. And he got it back down to the beach. But still, how to get them back, how to get everybody out of the valley, he thought really hard. And he realized that because everyone had left the valley, some of them must have left boats along the riverside. And so he hiked back up the edge of the river until he found a boat that was tied up, pulled it further upstream so they had a fighting chance of getting from one side of the river to the other before the speed of the river hurled him into the oncoming surf. He barely made it, but he managed to get the boat across. What Jax had done was nothing short of a miracle, heroic to the max. The sea was so huge, just the fact that he would even swim out through the waves and body surf in on the other side, the whole thing was just, it was an adventure. It was an adventure that was beyond imagining, but they didn't have time to think about that now. The rain was still pouring. It was monsoon-like. It was torrential. And the pathway on their side of the river, you couldn't pull the boat as far away from the ocean as he had been able to when he came across. So they needed to get going. They gathered up the camp really fast, headed to the river, took a hold of the boat and the rope, and walked as far as they could, which is not that far, away from the raging surf, to give themselves again a fighting chance of trying to get the boat across before getting crushed by the waves. "How are we going to do this?" said the girl. "It's okay," said Jax. "I've got a plan. You and Sabina, you're going to go inside the boat and paddle like crazy with the oars. We're going to go, the three guys, we're going to go in the water and we're going to kick like crazy. And I think with all of us, even though we're close to the ocean, I think we can do it." She looked at the ocean waves. They were daunting. They were huge and they were really close. And it didn't seem super likely that they were going to make it across before getting pummeled in the surf. But it was the only chance they had, and they had run out of food. And they had to get across. It had to work. It had to work. So with a lot of trepidation, they climbed into the boat. The guys climbed into the water. The girls took up the paddles, and they pushed away from the bank into the torrential river. Do you think they made it? Do you think they got across? Barely, 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 with all five of them working as hard as they could. They weren't that far from the surf, and the river was so fast. But they made it just before the surf break, just before hitting the ocean waves. As they slammed into the opposite bank, Sabina and I jumped out of the boat, pulled the rope, and grabbed the boat and dragged it as far away from the surf as we could, while the guys scrambled ashore. We had only just made it before being crushed by the ocean waves. But we made it. We made it. Hearts beating so fast. We pulled the boat up on the shore. Jax took it back up the river, returned it to where he had found it. All of us in the truck, barely anyone spoke. We drove back up through the winding, intense road out of Waipio, so steep that with everything the truck had gone through, we wondered if we'd even get the truck out of the valley. But we did. And we made it home, to my home, just before noon, exactly the way that Greg had told Human we would. As we walked in the door, the clock struck 12. literally. And what I noticed first was the light was flashing on my phone. There were 13 messages waiting. All of them were from the same person. All of them were from my mom. All of them said the same thing. Bridie, I know you're in trouble. Something's happening. You've got to let me know that you're okay. Where are you? She had called over and over and over again since the moment they first got caught in the river flood. How did she know? How did Greg let Human know that we were safe and learn that Human was stuck in Kona in traffic that day? How did we get out of the river? How did I get out of the river without taking another step from the moment of the flash flood? Again, life is stranger than we think. It is stranger than we can think. And it is filled with mystery. And when you really, really want to know the answer to life, when you are relentless, when you go to the ends of the earth, as I did, and when you search without stopping, eventually, when you're so serious, and sometimes when you're up against the very hardest of times, as I had been at that time in my life, eventually life begins to reveal its secret to you. And it is worth every hardship and every trial to live a life in the mystery beyond all imagining. And there will be more stories, and there were more stories, but those are for another day. Namaste.